underage girls, women that were already married, secrecy, lies. Today I'm going to start talking about Joseph Smith's polygamy. Welcome to Candlewick Library. I'm Cheryl. Last week I mentioned that I would be starting to talk about polygamy, and this was going to be a really hard few weeks. I really want to go into detail. I feel like it is so important that we know these women that he married, because the LDS apologetic response is to point out how faithful these women were and how so many of them spoke positively about polygamy later in life, as if that excuses it. And so I feel like it's very important to not only give the story so you can see what their lives were like in polygamy, what they gave up, and think about how their lives could have been different. And then we'll talk a little bit more about what they might have said later at the end. I'm going to be breaking this up into a few videos covering the chapters in her book that mention polygamy and talk about it. And then I will be talking in more depth about each woman that we know for sure was a wife of Joseph Smith. There are quite a few that we don't know for sure, and so I won't be covering those. And then I will be doing a video where I will read the Gospel Topics essay from the LDS Church explaining polygamy in their words, so that you can get the big overview of exactly what the polygamy was and then hear how they talk about it. Before I begin, I feel like I need to give a little bit of information about where the things I talk about are going to be coming from. Of course, some of it is coming from No Man Knows My History. We'll be talking about what she says in here, and then, like I said, I will be going further. The other information that I will be sharing came from quite a few different sources. The Utah church historian Andrew Jensen's work in 1887, and of course he was the historian for the church, so he was a faithful approach. The church library in Salt Lake City, the genealogical archives in Salt Lake City, the Nauvoo Temple record for 1846, Lindsay Hansen Park's podcast, A Year in Polygamy, LDS Discussions, which I've used on here before, a man named Mike that runs that, as well as historical and city records and journals of all of the people involved. There are also two historical cases of note. One was the Temple Lot case. The Temple Lot case was a legal case in the 1890s, which addressed the legal ownership of the area where the temple was supposed to be built in Independence, Missouri. When Joseph died, eventually his wife and children went back to that area and kept the church going under a different name under their leadership. The mainstream LDS church that people know today came to Utah under the leadership of Brigham Young. So both churches were in a legal battle over who owned that land. And because of that, there were affidavits given by many of the women that Joseph Smith married. And in these affidavits, they gave detailed information that yes, they were wives in every meaning of the word, which goes against an argument a lot of people try to use. So some of the information comes from the affidavits they gave in court for that case. Also, one of Joseph Smith's sons eventually came to Utah and began interviewing a lot of people because he had been taught that his father wasn't a polygamist, that it was all a lie, and he wanted to know the truth. And so he came to Utah and interviewed a lot of people to find out the truth about his father. So there's a lot of information that comes from that as well. So today I'm starting in chapter 21, If a Man Entice a Maid. A couple of paragraphs down, she writes, when he described the new patriarchal order of marriage to Parley Pratt during their weeks together in Philadelphia in 1840, it was with the freshness and enthusiasm of a man who had stumbled quite by chance upon an ancient treasure. He taught me many great and glorious principles concerning God and the heavenly order of eternity, Pratt said. It was at this time that I received from him the first idea of eternal family organization and the eternal union of the sexes in those inexpressible, endearing relationships which none but the highly intellectual, the refined, and pure in heart know how to prize, and which are the foundation of everything worthy to be called happiness. Pratt had buried his first wife, with whom he had been very much in love, and had since remarried. Joseph now promised him that he would have both wives in heaven, provided that he was sealed to them in the temple under the new and everlasting covenant. And since heaven would bless his union with both wives in the hereafter, it could not logically frown on him having more than one wife here on earth. There was plenty of precedent for plural marriages in the Old Testament, beginning with Father Abraham. But it was Jacob's polygamous marriages that particularly interested Joseph Smith, and he frequently referred to the new marriage principle as the blessing of Jacob. He was fond of pointing to the commandment in Exodus, and if a man entice a maid that is not betrothed, and lie with her, he shall surely endow her to be his wife. The sin of adultery lay not in the act itself, but in the subsequent desertion. It was the abandonment of the humbled maid that led to the unspeakable evils of prostitution and infanticide. Until the day it could be publicly proclaimed, any whisper of the doctrine of plural wives must be vehemently denied. To break the ground before sowing broadcast the seeds of his new doctrine, Joseph's Press published a pamphlet in defense of polygamy by one Udny H. Jacob. Jacob produced a document of astonishing sophistication, advocating polygamy not only in the light of the Old Testament precedent, but also as a solution for marital incompatibility. Although a woman is not known to be an adulteress, he wrote, yet she may be a perfect devil to her husband. Train him in the most imperious manner, despise him in her heart, abuse him before his children, drive him like a menial slave where she pleases, and he must tamely submit to the ungodly law of his wife, must hug the serpent to his bosom, and love her as he does his own body. Impossible and degrading to the nature of man. Such a wife must not be divorced, he said, for a divorced man is not known in the whole canon of scriptures. But for her to continue performing the rituals of the marriage bed without any love for her husband, which he labeled fornication in the wife, was a gross sin. In ancient times, under the law of God, he concluded, the permission of a plurality of wives had a direct tendency to prevent the possibility of fornication in the wife. That comes from, like she said, Jacob Udny's pamphlet that was called The Peacemaker. I mentioned in one of my weekly videos of books that I read in January, Under the Banner of Heaven. In that book and TV show, they talk about The Peacemaker and how it was this pamphlet that had really, really horrible ideas about marriage and women in general. And this was something a lot of people didn't believe that Joseph Smith wrote, and he probably didn't. The other guy probably did write it, but Joseph Smith did publish it, and he did approve of it when it first came out, and there is proof of that. In that pamphlet, it goes on to say, the idea of a woman taking a man to be her husband is not found in the Word of God. But the man marries the woman, and the woman is given in marriage, but the husband is not the property of the wife in any sense of the word. There is no positive law of God against a man's marrying Leah and Rachel both. To God only are men accountable in this matter and not to their wives. So when that first came out, it really did cause a stir even at that time, and he was forced to then denounce it. But you can still find copies of it. You can still see his name on the title page and that he had printed it. She goes on to say, Paul had said that in heaven there would be no marriage or giving in marriage, but Joseph taught that this would not apply to his saints. That which he and his elders sealed on earth would be binding also in heaven. There a man would have not only his wives and children, but also the prerogative of procreating more until, as he expressed it to Parley Pratt, the result of our endless union would be offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven or the sands of the seashore. This was the road to godhood. A man's glory in the next world would be determined by the knowledge he had gained and the excellence of his works upon earth. He who entered heaven with, quote, 10 talents would have tenfold the glory of a man with one, and his rate of progress toward godhood would be 10 times as rapid as that of the man who had been blind to the truth upon earth. There were many instances where, when they're talking about polygamy, men in the church referred to the talents parable. Women were property. Similarly, if a man went to heaven with 10 wives, he would have more than tenfold the blessings of a mere monogamist, for all the children begotten through these wives would enhance his kingdom. The man with only one wife, on the other hand, would be denied even her and forced to spend eternity as a ministering angel rather than a god. This has been taught by church leaders back then, that if you were a man who did not accept polygamy, you didn't have to practice it necessarily if you didn't find the right women. But if you believed in polygamy and you believed in it as a doctrine, then when you went to heaven, then you would be able to be married to your wife still and get more. But if you didn't believe in it and you denounced polygamy, that when you got to heaven, if you weren't willing to be a polygamist, then you lose the wife you already have. So even if they're still in the temple, you still don't get to be together. Joseph taught that God himself was once as we are now and is an exalted man. He had increased in skill and wisdom until he had come to govern myriads of worlds, peopled by spirits of his own procreation. Ahead of every man there stretched the same boundless opportunity for progression throughout eternity. Lorenzo Snow caught the essence of this philosophy in a terse and provocative line, as man is, God once was, and as God is, man may become. On the next page, she goes on. Although many of the leading Mormon officials converted their first wives to polygamy before taking a second, Joseph did not take Emma into his confidence. Neither did he confide in his friends. There was disagreement among them in later years over the identity of his first plural wife. Some, like Benjamin Johnson, were certain that it had been Fanny Alger, but others held that plural marriage was not officially inaugurated until April 5th, 1841, the eve of the 11th anniversary of the founding of the church, when he married the attractive 26-year-old Louisa Beaman. But it is doubtful if Louisa was even second on the list. When this says that Benjamin Johnson was sure that Fanny Alger was the first plural wife, that's what's alluded to in the Saints book put out by the church. That's what they say in the church essay, as you'll find out when I read that. And I don't believe that, actually. I believe that was only an affair, and that they have proactively gone back and made it into a marriage so that it doesn't look like he had an affair with a teenager that was living with him. But I'm going to stop for a minute and talk about Fanny Alger. I don't have any pictures of her. I have collected pictures of many of the people that I will be talking about in the next few videos. And so when I have a picture, I will put it up. But I do not have one of Fanny. And I did talk about her a little bit in an earlier video, so I'm not going to go into as much detail about her as I am some of the other women. She was somewhere between 16 and 18 when they had their relationship. She was described as very pretty and very likable. She lived in the Smith home and worked as a maid for them. When she came to live with them, she was 15 years old, and they spoke of her like an adopted daughter that Emma was devoted to. But then Emma told William Law that she saw Joseph in the barn with Fanny. There was another man that spoke of it later and said that they were, quote, celestializing. Oliver Cowdery, who we've spoken of many times on these videos, he wrote a letter to his brother where he referred to it as a filthy, stinking affair. Will Wilhelm is quoted as saying, Emma was furious and drove the girl, who was unable to conceal the consequences of her celestial relation with the prophet, out of her house. There is a lot of speculation of what that means, unable to conceal her relationship any longer. Whether that meant just that Emma saw them in the barn together doing whatever they were doing, or whether she was pregnant. So Emma kicked her out and she moved away with her family. 3 months later, she married a boy named Solomon Custer and then had a child. But I don't know for sure how soon after she had that child. So it is very possible that that child was with her new husband, but there is some speculation of whether it was early enough to have been Joseph's, or whether she had been pregnant and lost the baby. I think that we have to assume that what she couldn't conceal was just that there was an affair happening, because we don't have enough facts about whether she had a child with Joseph or not. But we do know, even from the church sources, that Emma found Joseph and Fanny in the barn together. Later on in life, when she was asked about her relationship with Joseph, she replied, "It is a matter of my own," so she wouldn't talk about it. The church and others now claim that she was the first plural wife. However, one problem with this to think about is the fact that Joseph claims that he was given these priesthood keys that were being restored on earth, and that those sealing keys were what he used to seal people to be married after this life. Before they had the Nauvoo temple built, then they would perform these marriages where they were saying that they were being sealed for time and eternity, or just time or just eternity. And time meant life, eternity meant eternity, obviously. They would perform these marriages as such. But when the Nauvoo temple was finished and Joseph was no longer around, they redid a lot of the for eternity marriages in the temple, saying that they needed to do them in the temple now that the temple was built. But apparently they believed that those keys made them able to do those sealings even before the temple. Well, Joseph didn't have those keys yet when he was with Fanny. So I don't understand the argument of her being the first plural wife in that way. Von Brody mentions two women. These are Lucinda Harris and Presendia Huntington Bule. So I'm going to touch on both of them. Lucinda Morgan Harris was born in 1801 in Virginia. She was married to the famous anti-Masonic martyr, William Morgan. She married him when she was 16 years old. They had 2 children. He operated a brewery in Canada, but lost all of that, and then they moved back to the United States. He went by Captain Morgan. Captain Morgan announced that he was writing a book that was going to expose all of the Masonic rituals and secrets. A bunch of Masons came and set fire to the establishment that was going to be printing the book. On September 11th, 1826, they arrested him. The man who had paid for the advance of this book paid the bail to get him out of jail, but he was arrested again. This time, someone showed up to pay the bill who claimed to be a friend of his. We don't know whether he was or not. He was put into a carriage, and then later that carriage showed up at Fort Niagara. It was claimed at the time that they took him out into the middle of the Niagara River and drowned him. And there was one man that confessed to the murder. In October of 1827, a body washed up on the shore, and they believed that this was Captain Morgan. But a widow of a missing Canadian man identified that this was her husband based on his clothing. And so he was identified as Timothy Monroe. 3 Masons were charged with the kidnapping of Captain Morgan, but then the Masons themselves claimed that he wasn't killed, that they took him and he disappeared. So no one knows for sure whether he was killed or whether he just disappeared. 3 years after his disappearance, Lucinda remarried. She married George Washington Harris, who was their former landlord. They moved to Indiana, where they would eventually meet Joseph Smith. In 1834, they would both join the church and move to Missouri. In 1838, when Joseph came to Missouri, which we've talked about in a previous video, Joseph and Emma lived with her and her husband for 2 months. There is speculation that this is when he started courting her and that they might have started their relationship at this point. The exact date of their marriage is unknown, but it is believed to be in 1838, when she would have been 37 years old. She was friends with Sarah Pratt, and Sarah Pratt did indicate that it was during this 2-month time that they might have been married. And Sarah Pratt also said that she had claimed to be his mistress. Lucinda was described as a very pretty and intelligent woman. She continued to live with her husband after her marriage to Joseph Smith, and it is unclear whether her husband knew about their marriage or not. When Joseph Smith went to Nauvoo, he sent for them and told them that he had purchased a lot for them across the street from his house. Not much else is known of their relationship, but some claim that she was only his mistress and that there never was a marriage ceremony. When Joseph died, a reporter wrote about how she reacted to his body at the funeral by writing, "Standing at the head of Joseph Smith's body, her face covered and her whole frame convulsing with weeping." Later, she did divorce George Harris, and we don't know too much about her life after that. There is a lot of information that makes it look like she might have converted to Catholicism. The next woman I'm going to talk about is Presendia Huntington Bule. Presendia was 16 when she married Norman Bule. She had her first child, George, when she was 19. And then she had a second son, Silas. But unfortunately, one day she was boiling down cider in one of the rooms of their home in a big brass kettle. Silas wandered in and fell into the kettle. She tended to him for 13 hours and then he died. She soon had another pregnancy, but that third son died as well. Her sister Zina, who would also later become one of Joseph Smith's wives, had converted to Mormonism and introduced her to it. She joined in Kirtland, Ohio in 1836 along with her husband. Soon after, she had another child die within a month of the birth. Her husband at this point had a falling out with the church and was deemed an apostate. Presendia herself was known for having a lot of spiritual visions and spiritual experiences, and she would talk openly about these experiences. She had another daughter named Adeline who died when she was only 4 hours old, and the next child, Oliver, did survive. She moved to Lima, Illinois, near Nauvoo. In October of 1841, Joseph married her sister. It is at this point that a lot of people believe that he introduced this to Presendia. When Joseph introduced her into the doctrine of polygamy, she said she knew Joseph Smith to be a man of God, and so she accepted the sealing with Joseph. We got a lot of information from her brother Dimmock because he gave both sisters to Joseph. From that information, it says that they were married on December 11th, 1841. Joseph Smith, when he came to him for his sisters, offered him any reward he wanted. Alluding to salvation, Dimmock said, "Where you and your father's family are, there I and my father's family may also be." So he was sealed to Joseph through the law of adoption. Joseph Smith was sealed to men as well, which is something I didn't know until a couple years ago, and I think a lot of people don't know. But he was sealed in adoption. The way that an LDS family now, if they adopt a child, they will take them to the temple and seal them to them. This is something to keep in mind as we talk about women that he married, that he could have done the same with women. He didn't have to marry them as wives. So when people argue that, well, he just married them as wife to take care of them, but it wasn't a wife relationship, then I do bring up, especially with the younger ones, then why didn't he do it the same way he did with men? Presendia continued to live with her first husband after this marriage. And again, it's not clear whether her husband knew about it at this time or not. Soon after, she had another child, but that child also died. So out of all of her children, I believe she had 7 children and only 2 survived. After Joseph Smith's death, she married Apostle Heber C. Kimball, but she continued to live with Norman. Her brother said this, "Presendia's husband would not follow the church any longer, so she left him and followed after her lord Kimball. When the church moved, she took her 6-year-old son, but left the 16-year-old behind and left the husband. Her husband tried to find her and eventually did find her at Winter's Quarters in 1848. He asked her to get back together. He even offered to come to Utah, but she refused. It is believed that he was unaware of the fact that she was now married to Heber C. Kimball as well. Heber C. Kimball we are going to talk about a lot. A lot of Joseph's wives ended up being married off to other men in the church after his death. And Heber C. Kimball is one that's going to come up a lot. He was married to 45 women, and he had trouble taking care of any of them, so most of the women he married were just destitute for the rest of their lives. In Utah, she made a living by house cleaning and teaching school and being a midwife. She had a daughter with Heber, but she later drowned in City Creek. Presendia became very ill after this death, but she recovered and then soon became pregnant again. This time she had a boy, Joseph Smith Kimball. During this time, it was the grasshopper famine, where the grasshoppers came in and were eating everything, and the rations were put down to half rations. But she prayed to God that she could survive on even less than that so she could give more to her children. On June 27th, 1859, she and some friends climbed Ensign Peak to commemorate the death of Joseph Smith, which I believe some people still do occasionally. Ensign Peak is a mountain right up behind Salt Lake City. Presendia died at the age of 81 in 1892. One thing I should also mention here is that when these women were passed on to another man afterward, sometimes it will specify for time or eternity, like I think I said that before. She was besealed to Joseph for eternity. So that means that in LDS theology, any children that she had with Heber C. Kimball would technically be Joseph Smith's in heaven. So Heber C. Kimball would know that, and he would know that I'm married to this woman here on earth, but afterwards she's going to belong to Joseph Smith, and so are my children, and I'm not going to be with them again. Another thing that Presendia did say is that during the time that her husband was considered an apostate, she did have a son, and she later told someone that she didn't know whether that son was Norman's or Joseph's. Back to the book, she says, before the expulsion of John C. Bennett in June 1842, Joseph had been married or sealed to an imposing list of women, almost all of them already married. In addition to Louisa Beaman, Mrs. Harris, and Mrs. Bule, there was Mrs. Zina Huntington Jacobs, Mrs. Mary Rollins Lightner, Mrs. Patty Sessions, possibly Mrs. Clarissa Hancock, and Mrs. Sally Gully, and probably Mrs. Nancy Hyde, with a Mrs. Durfee at the bottom of the list. So now I'm going to go through some of those women. So first, Louisa Beaman. You know that I have talked about her before. This picture of her is just a sketch of her. She is known as Joseph Smith's first plural wife, or second for those that believe Fanny was. Her first recognized sealing was in Nauvoo in 1841, and it is important to note here that that was before Emma Smith. I will get into this later on what number Emma Smith was, but Joseph Smith was sealed to many women before he was sealed to his actual legal wife, Emma Smith. Louisa met Joseph Smith when he visited her family and stayed with them in New York when she was 19. She joined the church and moved to Kirtland. Her father died there, and then her family moved to Missouri and then to Nauvoo. Her mother died soon after, probably of malaria. She moved in with her sister Mary and her sister's husband, Joseph Bates Noble. In the fall of 1840, Joseph Smith taught that brother-in-law the principle of polygamy and asked him to perform a marriage with Louisa, who was by then 25 years old. So they were married on April 5th, 1841, quote, in a grove near Main Street in the city of Nauvoo. Joseph Smith dictated the ceremony to the brother-in-law, and then he repeated it back. This had to be so private that Louisa was dressed as a man. She was wearing a man's hat and coat as a disguise. Joseph, her brother-in-law, recalled that after the ceremony, the couple spent their wedding night, quote, right across the river at my house. One thing to remember about this as well is when people say that he didn't sleep with these women, they didn't have a real marriage, you will see many cases where people that were involved said that no, he went and had a wedding night. He went and slept with them somewhere, and they know that for a fact. It also is important to note that this happened before the revelation that is in Doctrine and Covenants that is allowing polygamy. After Joseph Smith's death, Louisa married Brigham Young for time only. In 1848, she had her first children, twin boys that she named Hiram and Joseph. They both died. In 1850, she had another set of twin boys that she named Alva and Alma, and they also both died. She became ill and died in Salt Lake City on May 15th, 1850, at only 35 years old, and it's believed that she may have had breast cancer. Some sources say that she had even more kids than that also died, but those are the four that we know of for sure. There was a little town in Utah that I'd never heard of the real name, and I didn't write it down, so I can't give that to you. I'm sorry. It was termed Fort Louisa in honor of her as the first woman to enter into the order of celestial marriage in this dispensation. Her story is one that I do find very sad. Even though there's not as much information as we'll get on some of the later women, you see that she died very young. In those years, to have lost every child she had, but also to have a secret marriage to Joseph Smith, and then to have to be married to another man, Brigham Young. and not be either of their only wife. I find that very sad. Next, we're going to talk about Mirinda Nancy Johnson Hyde. Mirinda was born in 1815 in Vermont. Joseph Smith lived with her family. This is a girl I spoke of in an earlier video, when I talked about the time in Kirtland when Joseph Smith was tarred and feathered. And I said that there was a man in the group, in the mob, that was a brother, that was part of the family that Joseph Smith and Emma were living with, and that he said that he had become too familiar with his teenage sister. This is that sister. So she met Joseph Smith while he was living with her family. Both of her brothers, Lyman and Luke Johnson, criticized Joseph Smith publicly, so they are looked down on. In 1833, Mirinda married Orson Hyde. Within about a year of their marriage, Orson was called to be an apostle of the church. And so he would spend the next 2 years of their life traveling the eastern states and England as a missionary. So during this, she was home alone raising the 2 children that they had during this time. By 1839, they had moved to Nauvoo and had a 3rd child. In 1840, Orson was sent to Jerusalem for a 3-year mission. While he was gone, Mirinda had to, quote, live in a little log house whose windows had no glass, but in place of which were pieces of grease paper, and she also spoke of how little food she had to provide for her children. Joseph Smith received a revelation on December 2nd, 1841 to marry her, and in spring of 1842, she married him. This is a really important story because when people talk about the women that Joseph married that were already married to other men, they will usually bring up that those men were not members or they were apostates. So it is important to remember that Mirinda was married to Joseph Smith while her husband, Orson Hyde, was on a mission for the church in Jerusalem. One person's report said that Joseph Smith slept with Orson Hyde's wife under the same roof. 8 months later, Orson Hyde returned from his mission. It's unclear whether he knew about the marriage of his wife to Joseph Smith or not, but at this point he did learn of plural marriage and he took on 2 additional wives himself, and she did consent to those. After Joseph Smith's death, she and Orson continued to live in Nauvoo, and in fact Orson dedicated the temple, but then they left Nauvoo. She would go on to have 7 more children, and he would continue to serve missions and to marry 7 additional wives. In 1870, she divorced him after 34 years of marriage. He was 58 years old at this point, and he was continuing to marry younger and younger women. They were living in Council Bluffs at this time, and so she came to Utah. She was on the board of directors for the Deseret Hospital, and she also was someone who fought for women's rights in Utah. And she died in 1886 in Salt Lake City. The next wife I'm going to talk about is Elizabeth Davis Durfee. This is a wife that it's possible Joseph didn't have any kind of physical relationship with. She was born in 1791 in New York. She married her first husband, Gilbert Goldsmith, when she was 20 years old. He was 25, and he was a sailor. They had twin boys, and one died. A month later, her husband's boat capsized, and he drowned. After this, she married Joseph Blanchett Brackenberg, an English immigrant, in 1818. They had 2 sons and moved to Ohio. There, they had 3 more children, and unfortunately, 1 more died at birth. In 1831, the family became LDS. Her husband became a high priest and was soon called on a mission. While he was on his mission in New York, he died. So now, at age 40, she was a widow for the 2nd time. She moved, along with a lot of the other saints, to Missouri, and there suffered really great persecution. And then she met Jabez, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, but Jabez Durfee. He was also a widower, and combined, they had 10 children. They moved to Nauvoo together in 1839, and she was influential in the creation of the Relief Society, which is the women's organization of the LDS Church. In spring of 1842, at age 51, she married Joseph Smith. We don't know too much about their marriage to each other, but what we do know is that she was part of a group of women that were known as the Mothers of Israel, and that these older women would be used to introduce the doctrine of polygamy to younger women that were maybe more hesitant to marry Joseph. Mrs. Durfee was said to be a good friend of Emma Smith, but Emma Smith did not know that Mrs. Durfee was married to her husband. She received the endowment in the temple and entered the Holy Order on October 1st, 1843, one of the first people to do so. While married to Joseph, she continued to live with her husband, but they ended up separating in 1844 after Joseph Smith died. At that point, she married a man named Cornelius Lot, who also had other wives, one of them a 15-year-old. And one of his daughters had been another wife of Joseph Smith. They started west, but then they decided to go back to Quincy. But Cornelius decided he did want to go to Utah still, and so he went on to Utah and took more wives there. Elizabeth remained behind and remained friends with Emma. It is said that she joined the RLDS that Joseph Smith's son was the president of later on in her life. And we don't know too much about her life after that, except that it is believed that she died at 85 years old in Kansas when she was hit by a train, which is odd. Sarah Pratt said about her There was an old woman called Durfee. She knew a good deal about the prophet's amorous adventures, and to keep her quiet, he admitted her to the secret blessings of celestial bliss. And that is one of the reasons we believe she may not have been a physical relationship wife. It may have been that she knew what was going on, had figured it out, and he brought her in as a co-conspirator. And that might have been why he married her. Now I'm going to talk about Zina Huntington Jacobs Young Smith. Growing up, Zina was very active in household skills, and she was very talented at the cello. In 1835, Hiram Smith and David Whitmer came and taught her family about the LDS Church, and they were baptized. They moved to Kirtland, and she became a member of the choir. She was very musical. Later on, her family ends up in Nauvoo, and she became very sick, but she did recover. At this time, she was 18 years old and began to be courted by Henry Jacobs. Henry was very handsome and was also extremely musical, so they were considered a great match. But Joseph Smith came to her and explained the principle of celestial marriage to her and asked her to be his wife. She wrote this: "O dear heaven, grant me wisdom. Help me to know the way. O Lord my God, let thy will be done, and with thine arm around about to guide and shield and direct." She had a real conflict with this proposal and her relationship with Henry. She said no. She said no to Joseph Smith, and she married Henry instead. Within months of her marriage to Henry, Joseph reached out to her again, and she wrote this: "Joseph sent word to me by my brother, saying, Tell Zina I put it off and put it off until an angel with a drawn sword stood by me, and told me that if I did not establish this principle upon the earth, I would lose my position and my life. The Lord had made it known to him that she was to be his celestial wife." So at this point, she had already said no to him. She'd married somebody she actually loved and had things in common with, and was closer to her age. But she believed Joseph Smith was a prophet of God, and he's telling her that an angel with a drawn sword has threatened to kill him and take away his position if he does not marry her. So she decides to follow this commandment and marry Joseph. So she married him on October 7th while she was 7 months pregnant. She wrote this: "When I heard that God had revealed the law of celestial marriage, I obtained a testimony for myself that God had required that order to be established in this church. I made a greater sacrifice than to give my life, for I never anticipated it again to be looked upon as an honorable woman by those I dearly loved. It was something too sacred to be talked about. It was more to me than life or death. I never breathed it for years." Henry was aware of the wedding, and they continued to live in the same home. It's hard to understand how her husband was okay with this, but he did say this: "Whatever the prophet did was right, without making the wisdom of God's authorities bend to the reasoning of any man." So he also believed this is a prophet of God, so this must be the right thing. Zina and Henry had 2 sons. Henry was sent on several missions to Chicago, New York, and Tennessee. During one of his missions, before this happened, Henry was bragging to John D. Lee about his wife. John D. Lee said that Jacobs was bragging about his wife, what a true, virtuous, lovely woman she was. He almost worshipped her. So we get the picture of how he thought of his wife and how she probably was before Joseph Smith came to her. Shortly after Joseph Smith's death, she married Brigham Young in 1844. In May of 1846, Henry was sent on a mission to England. While he was there, she began living openly with Brigham Young and did so for the rest of her life. When her husband came back, Brigham Young said this to him: "Brother Jacobs, the woman you claim for a wife does not belong to you. She is the spiritual wife of Brother Joseph, sealed up to him. I am his proxy, and she, in his behalf, with her children, are my property." You can imagine how heartbreaking that would be to hear about your wife, even if you had allowed these things to happen. He said this to her: "The same affection is there, but I feel alone. I do not blame any person. May the Lord or Father bless Brother Brigham. All is right according to the law of the celestial kingdom of our God Joseph." She would later have a 3rd child, a daughter, who would later marry Hugh B. Brown, who is a higher name in the church as well. Brigham Young took the Relief Society away for a while after coming to Salt Lake, but then in 1880, when it was restored, she was first counselor and then later the 3rd president of the Relief Society. She died in 1901 at the age of 80. Her husband would also later decide to marry more wives and become a polygamist. They never lived together again, but they also never divorced. During this time, there's also mention of a Mrs. Harris and a Mrs. Bule, but there is no information on those 2. And then there was a Clarissa Reed Hancock. She was the wife of Levi W. Hancock. I had a hard time finding any information about her outside of the book, except for her name. Vaughn writes, "There is a tradition among some of the descendants of Levi Hancock that Mrs. Hancock was sealed to Joseph Smith in Nauvoo and that one of her sons may have been his child. Since there seems to be no printed or manuscript evidence to support this story, however, it must be taken with considerable reserve. It is of some interest, however, to note that one of Levi Hancock's sons, born on June 9, 1845 in Nauvoo, was named Levi's son, as though to distinguish his parentage from that of the preceding son, born on April 19, 1841, who was named John Reed Hancock. The latter might have been the child in question. Mrs. Hancock was born on December 18, 1814 in New Hampshire. I also don't have very much information on Sally Gully, and so I'm going to read from this about her as well. She was wife of Samuel Gully. She was born in Saratoga, New York on October 24, 1815. The date of her marriage to Samuel is not known, but the Nauvoo Temple record states that on January 29, 1846, she was stilled to Joseph Smith Jr. for eternity and Gully for time. Since John C. Bennett listed a Mrs. G as one of Joseph's wives, it is possible that he was referring to Mrs. Gully. If so, then it would seem that her marriage to Joseph Smith took place before 1842. The next wife I'm going to talk about is Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner. She was born in 1818. Her father was shipwrecked, and she was 10 years old when her family moved to Kirtland. Her family lived in a house there that belonged to Algernon Sidney Gilbert, her mother's sister's husband. They lived there for 2 years when they heard about the Book of Mormon. She first met Joseph Smith in 1831 there in Kirtland. She wrote this: "When he saw me, he looked at me so earnestly I felt almost afraid, and I thought, he can read my every thought. And I thought how blue his eyes were. After a moment or two, he came and put his hands on my head and gave me a great blessing, the first I ever received. Later on," she wrote, "he told me about his great vision concerning me. He said I was the first woman God commanded him to take as a plural wife." Now, she would have been 12 at this time, so we don't know whether he had told her when she was 12 or if he later on told her that he had that vision. That is unclear. Most people, I think, assume that he probably told her later. Otherwise, she may not have married somebody else in between. In the fall of that year, her family left for Missouri. Mary believed that she had the gift of tongues, so she definitely believed in a lot of the more charismatic parts of the church at that time. What Mary is most well known for is there is a story of in Missouri when the mobs were attacking that they burnt down the printing press where the Book of Commandments, which is now the Doctrine and Covenants, was being printed. And her and this other girl went out and gathered all of the pages and saved the Book of Commandments. I have heard that story so many times in my time in the church, and in fact, the Saints book had the story in there as well. What they don't often remember to tell you is that that little girl would become one of Joseph Smith's wife. 3 years after this, she re-meets Joseph Smith. She would be reunited with Joseph Smith when he came to Missouri as part of that Zion's camp that we talked about in a different video. She remembers this. "In 1834, he was commanded to take me for a wife. I was 1,000 miles from him and he got afraid." So at that time, she would have been 16 years old. Again, we don't know if he told her that then or if he told her that later. Joseph Smith returned to Kirtland, and it is said that she rejected his offer. So there is some speculation there. Did he say it to her at that time? Did he not? We don't know for sure. In 1835, she met Adam Lightner. He was a 25-year-old non-Mormon from Pennsylvania, and they got married on August 11th. They moved to Far West where he opened up a store. She had her first child, they named Miles Henry. Things were really bad. They became stranded in Kentucky to avoid the mobs, and she was doing sewing and painting to get by, but it wasn't enough. She bought molasses and cornmeal to feed her family to try to keep them from starving, but her husband and the baby became sick from this diet. At this point, they heard that the Saints were gathering in Illinois, and so they gathered all of their meager possessions and sold everything that they could and headed to Illinois. They ended up living in Mary's mother's cabin in Montrose, which was across the river from Nauvoo. She had a second child, a daughter named Caroline, but Adam was unable to find work. And so they moved to Farmington, which was 50 miles east of Nauvoo, and they settled there. Adam was then able to do some carpentry, but then their bank failed. They couldn't make ends meet again, and they moved back to Nauvoo. Adam had loaned $2,000 to the church brethren, and so at this point he's trying to get that back. They really need it, and they defaulted on that loan. One of the men paid them with a barrel of pork, but it was full of weevils, so they couldn't even eat it. He's unemployed again, and she starts giving painting lessons. She began teaching painting to Joseph Smith's daughter. In 1842, he approached her. At first, she said no. She wrote this: "I asked if Emma knew about me, and he said, 'Emma thinks the world of you.'" But then she would say that she did not get sealed to him until after she had her own witness. I told you that she believed she had the gift of tongues. she started to believe that she was having visions and dreams about this as well. And so she decided to go ahead and marry him. Brigham Young performed the sealing, and Heber C. Kimball was a witness. She wrote this: "I knew he had 6 wives, and I have known some of them from childhood. I knew he had 3 children, they told me. I think 2 are living today, but they are not known as his children, and they go by other names." That also goes against that narrative where everybody says, oh, he wasn't a polygamist, or he wasn't having that kind of relationship with these wives because he didn't have any children with anybody but Emma. But that is not the only person who was faithful and was part of this that has said that he had children. This was in February 1842 that she became his wife, but she did continue to live with her husband Adam. Adam found a job in a different area and bought a log house closer to that. And so as they were preparing to move, Joseph Smith was distraught and came to her and told her that if they moved, that only sadness would follow them and all these horrible things that would happen to them. And so then, of course, when they did have years of hardness, she always had to look back at that moment and think, oh, Joseph Smith was right. I shouldn't have left him. I shouldn't have left Nauvoo. Look at all this that's happened because of it. At one point, her husband was going to be baptized, but then he said he didn't feel worthy. After Joseph Smith's death, both Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball offered themselves to her as proxy husbands. She accepted Brigham Young, and she was sealed to him for a time in May of 1845. But she continued to live with Adam. When the church left Nauvoo, they stayed behind. Later, though, they would end up coming to Utah, but once they were in Utah, she had extreme poverty and depression. After her husband's death, their 24-year-old son was convicted of grand larceny. She worked really hard to free him of this, and she believed he was innocent. But she dealt with depression for the rest of her life, and in fact, the Relief Society kept in contact with her, but they would often chastise her for her dark moods. And she died in 1913. The next woman is Patty Sessions. Patty kept extensive journals. We had a lot of information from her. She is known for being a midwife in Nauvoo, on the plains, and in Utah. She was born on February 4th, 1795, and because of a lack of boys in her family, she worked in the fields as a child. In 1812, 17-year-old Patty married David Sessions, who was 22 years old. Her parents didn't approve of the marriage and wouldn't help them, but her dad did later express remorse for that. They moved to Ketchum to live with her husband David's parents. At some point during this time, I think it was her mother-in-law that was a midwife, and she couldn't go to help with the delivery of a baby. And so Patty went along instead, and she delivered this child. And the doctor told her at that point, "You are really good at this. You should go into midwifery." She and her husband started their own farm, and she took on weaving jobs. Their first child, Peregrine, was born in 1814, and soon they had a really thriving 400-acre farm and a grist mill. In June of 1816, their second son was born. Soon after that, she was baptized into the Methodist Church, and she had 2 more children, daughters Sylvia and Anna. A year later, David's parents moved in with them, and she took care of her mother-in-law who was in a wheelchair. Soon after that, they had their 5th child, David Jr., and then their daughter Anna died, and then her father-in-law died. In 1825, they had another daughter that they also named Anna. 2 years later, they had a 7th child named Bartlett, a son, but he died when he was 6 months old. And then the second Anna died as well. And soon after, Sylvanus died as well. In 1833, the Mormon missionaries came. She believed that they were telling her the truth, but she wouldn't be baptized without David's permission. She was 39 years old at this point. Their first child, Peregrine, he and his wife moved in with them. Brigham Young at this point came to Maine doing conferences at the Sessions farm. And so she and David ended up being baptized. They sold their farm, their livestock, and their mill so that they could give that money to the church and join the saints in Missouri. There they bought a farm in Far West, and their last child, Amanda, was born. But in 1840, they moved to Nauvoo. 2 years later, her daughter Sylvia would marry Joseph Smith, and I'll be talking about her in a minute. It's not clear whether Patty knew that her daughter Sylvia was married to Joseph Smith or not, but she married him a month later at 47 years old. So she was I'm about to turn 47, so she was around my age. But she never lived with Joseph Smith. She was also one of those women, the mothers in Israel, that would recruit younger girls. Her husband was also introduced to polygamy, and in 1845, he took a second wife. She stated that she would live practical polygamy, but she described it as demoralizing and painful. After Joseph's death, When they left Nauvoo, she got sick in winter quarters and was blessed by Brigham Young. When she recovered, the tensions between her and the other sister wives were really bad, and so David ended up moving out of her house, and she eventually returned to Nauvoo. She did make it to Utah later, and she was known there for giving powerful blessings, which is an interesting thing since usually women in the LDS Church are not the ones giving blessings. In 1847, she wrote in her diary that Heber C. Kimball requested her to be his wife for a time. David also took another wife, a 19-year-old divorcee who had a child. And he was 60 and Patty was 55 at this point when he takes a 19-year-old as a wife. And he spent most of his time with this younger girl. But then he had a stroke and she ended up being the one to take care of him until he died. She then married John Perry on December 1851. They seemed to be happy for about 2 years until he married Harriet, who was 31, and kept both of them in the same house until she left. He lived after that with Harriet. David's widow remarried and she left her daughter with Patty. And so Patty took care of her daughter until later on she did end up returning her to her mother. This new husband, John, died in 1868. On July 3rd, 1867, and then she died at 97 years old. Now we'll talk about her daughter, Sylvia Sessions. She was born July 31st, 1818. And as we talked about with her mom, the family joined the church in 1834, and they sold the farm and went to Missouri. Sylvia met Windsor Palmer Lyon, an army physician, and they were married in 1838. In February of 1839, they went to Nauvoo. In Nauvoo, they opened the Lyon Drug and Variety Shop. In 1843, Windsor was excommunicated for suing another church member over money that was owed to him. Their first child, Marion, was born in 1839 but died in 1842. And they had a second child, Philiphrine, in 1841, but she also died at 2.5 years old. Their son, Asa Windsor, was born and died on Christmas Day of 1842. And then she had Josephine Rosetta on February 8th, 1844, the month after Philiphrine's death. There is speculation that this, by descendants, that Josephine was not Windsor's biological child, but Joseph Smith's, because this was the time of his excommunication, and it was over 3 years before she would have another child after this daughter. Also, her name is Josephine, and this daughter later recalled that on Sylvia's deathbed, she called Josephine to her side and told her that her days were numbered and that she needed to tell her a secret. She said this: "She then told me that I was the daughter of the prophet Joseph Smith." After Joseph Smith's death, Sylvia married Heber C. Kimball on September 19th, 1844. They were married for time. Windsor was then rebaptized in 1845 or 46, and shortly after, Sylvia was resealed to Joseph Smith in the temple with Heber as proxy. Windsor then also joined in on the polygamy and took a second wife and had a child with her, but they continued to live together. In 1846, they sold their property in Nauvoo and moved to Iowa City. She had a 5th child and a 6th child, and then Windsor died of tuberculosis. A couple more of her children died, and so she had 2 surviving children at this point. But when the Saints went to Utah, she did not go with Heber C. Kimball. She stayed behind. In 1854, her brother went through the town, and so she joined in with and came to Utah with him. When she arrived in Utah, she was accepted back into Heber C. Kimball's family and settled on her own farm in Bountiful. She later moved on into a house on Bountiful's Main Street where she operated a hotel. In 1882, she died at the age of 63. Back to Fawn Brody's book for a moment. On page 303, she says, "The men who were taken into the system at this early period, Hiram Smith, Brigham Young, Heber Kimball, William Clayton, Willard Richards, and Benjamin F. Johnson, after an initial period of shock and spiritual torment, were won over with very little argument. Joseph's brother Don Carlos fought polygamy before his death in 1841. Any man, he said to Ebenezer Robinson in June of that year, who will preach and practice spiritual wifery will go to hell, no matter if it is my brother Joseph." But William Smith was an eager convert. His first plural wife was Mary Ann Sheffield, who had left a husband in England. "I never met William Smith but once before I married him," she related. "I met him coming from Keokuk. I think that was in April 1843. I do not know if I lived with him 2 weeks. I cannot tell whether I lived with him 1 week or not." Before the death of his first wife in 1845, William took at least 4 other plural wives. As we read this, we know that some of the women did know that their husbands were taking on extra wives. But just like Emma, she says the number of first wives who knew the truth about polygamy was then extremely small, and the remainder were seething with suspicion and furiously angry at what seemed to be the appalling moral laxity at Nauvoo. Emma probed and questioned every woman who came into the Relief Society organization, as she should, because there were women in there with her that were his wives that she didn't know about. Asserting her in the leadership of the society were some of the ablest women in the church: Mrs. Elizabeth Ann Whitney, Mrs. Sarah M. Cleveland, Elvira Cowles, and the poetess Eliza R. Snow. Joseph publicly commended them for their zeal in making a select society of the virtuous, but warned them that they must be extremely careful in their examinations or the consequences would be serious. And that was from the history of the church. Eventually, every one of these women became his plural wife, with the exception of Mrs. Whitney, who granted him instead the privilege of marrying her 17-year-old daughter, Sarah. So now I'm going to go through a few of those women that were mentioned. Sarah Kingsley Cleveland. She was born in 1788 in Massachusetts. She was wealthy and educated. She married John Howe in 1807. He was a sea merchant with his own ship. They had one child, Edward, and he died. We don't know how he died, but it was recorded that it was a painful death. In the War of 1812, her husband was captured by the English. He was later released, but he was in poor health and he did die. So she was widowed in 1825. After that, she married John Cleveland in 1826. And he had managed her husband's estate before his death. They had 2 children. In the 1830s, they joined the church. She and her daughter also spoke about having visions during this time. They moved to Quincy, Illinois, and Emma and her children lived with them in Quincy while Joseph was in jail the first time. After he was let go, he reunited with them at the Cleveland home for 3 weeks. He also gave them a lot in Nauvoo across from his house. So in 1842, they moved to Nauvoo. In the presidency of the church and in the what they call auxiliary departments, Relief Society, priesthood, things like that, there is the president, and then there's a first and a second counselor. So Sarah was the first counselor in the Relief Society to the president, Emma Smith. She was 54 years old now and became Joseph Smith's wife in 1842. At this point, Joseph would come to the Relief Society meetings and he would talk about how they didn't practice polygamy and he wasn't a polygamist, and Emma would sit there and agree with him. Meanwhile, her 2 counselors were both married to him. Eliza, the other counselor that was his wife, and Sarah lived in the same home, but at some point Eliza moved out because of some kind of tension. Soon after this is when Joseph died, and in 1846 they started to go to Utah, but her husband John was away and didn't go with them. But along the way she turned back and ended up returning to John, and she never went to Utah. She and John moved to a farm and she ended up joining a Protestant church and died in 1856. Elvira Cowles Holmes. She was born in 1813 in New York. 4 of her 7 siblings died, and her mother died when she was only 12. Her father remarried a 19-year-old that he would go on to have 6 children with. She was said to be a very good and kind stepmother. Her father was a school teacher and a Methodist minister, but somehow they were converted to Mormonism in 1830. Elvira was baptized at 22 years old. By 1839, they were all living in Nauvoo. Her father then was selected to be a counselor in the stake presidency there and a member of the Nauvoo City Council. At 27 years old, she began to work in Joseph Smith's home. She was helping Emma with the chores and with the children, and this is a pattern that you will see. While there, she became friends with Emily and Eliza Partridge, Lucy Walker, and Eliza Snow. She also met Jonathan Holmes, who was a widower and a bodyguard of Joseph Smith. In September of 1842, they became engaged. Joseph Smith performed their wedding, and so after that, she moved out of the Smith home. She was also one of the first women to serve in the Relief Society. She was the treasurer. On June 1st, 1843, 6 months after her marriage to Jonathan, she was sealed to Joseph Smith. And most believe that Jonathan did not know about it at that time. But he would know about it by 1846 because he stood proxy for Joseph Smith when she was resealed to him for eternity in the temple. At this point, he was sealed to her for time, and they sealed him for eternity to his first wife. But it is said that it weighed heavily on his mind that his children with her would be sealed to Joseph. But he had been very close to Joseph Smith and even been a pallbearer at his funeral. Her father became very disillusioned with the church, and he had publicly opposed polygamy and resigned as the stake president. He was one of the men that helped to publish the Nauvoo Expositor. I have a reprint of the Nauvoo Expositor. This is going to be what leads to Joseph Smith's death. So we're going to talk a lot more about that later, but her father was one of the people that helped to get this published. Elvira and Jonathan began to head west, but along the way, the U.S. government came to try to get men from the LDS Church to come help with what was going on with Mexico. And so they made a special battalion of Mormon men called the Mormon Battalion. and he joined the Mormon battalion, leaving her alone with 2 children at winter quarters, and her daughter died. After that, she drove their oxen team across the plains by herself. She arrived in Salt Lake City in 1847. She taught school at the old fort and lived there until she was reunited with her husband. When he returned, then they moved to Farmington, Utah. Unfortunately, he eventually did marry another wife as well. She died in 1871 at 57 years old, and it's just noted that she died from exposure. After this part in the chapter, she talks about a few of the women that said no. She talks about Mrs. Sarah Kimball, whom Joseph approached in 1842, told him to teach the concept to someone else, but she kept silent. Sarah M. Granger Kimball, so she was the wife of Hiram Kimball, and she later swore to an affidavit saying, "Early in 1842, Joseph taught me the principle of marriage for eternity and the doctrine of plural marriage. I asked him to teach it to someone else. He looked at me reprovingly and said, 'I will not cease to pray for you.'" Mrs. Orson Pratt, who also refused the prophet, confided in a few friends, but did not discuss polygamy publicly until she was an embittered and lonely old woman. But a self-possessed 18-year-old English girl, Martha Brotherton, chose to speak her mind. Brigham Young, who had not been lax in following his prophet's lead, had set his heart on the high-spirited English lass. He took her to the famous rendezvous over Joseph's store, locked the door, and proceeded with the curious bobtailed hortatory courtship that was becoming so common in the city. "Brother Joseph has had a revelation from God that it is lawful and right for a man to have 2 wives. If you will accept of me, I will take you straight to the celestial kingdom. And if you will have me in this world, I will have you in that which is to come. And Brother Joseph will marry us here today, and your parents will not know anything about it." When the girl demurred and begged for time, Brigham called in Joseph, who also urged her to make an immediate decision. "Just go ahead and do as Brigham wants you to," he said, and he added with a laugh, "He is the best man in the world except me." Then he went on more seriously, "If you will accept of Brigham, you shall be blessed. God shall bless you, and my blessing shall rest upon you. And if you do not like it in a month or 2, come to me, and I will make you free again. And if he turns you off, I will take you on." "Sir, it will be too late to think in a month or 2 after," Martha answered wryly. "I want time to think first." To this the prophet replied, "But the old proverb is, 'Nothing ventured, nothing gained.'" Finally and reluctantly, they let her go home where she promised to pray in secret for guidance. The moment she arrived, however, she wrote down the whole episode while it was still fresh in her memory and showed it to her parents. The Brothertons in high dudgeon took a steamboat to St. Louis, but not before they had given Martha's recital enough circulation so that everyone in Nauvoo knew it within a week. Eventually, Martha published her account in a St. Louis paper, and that was the St. Louis Bulletin on July 15, 1842. But even before it appeared, Joseph had taken measures to kill the rumors her departure had set in motion. Hiram, at the April conference, contradicted the report that a sister had been shut up in a room for several days and that they endeavored to induce her to believe in having 2 wives. The 12 apostles all testified that Joseph's principles were strictly virtuous, and Joseph himself took the stand in a blistering sermon against all adulterers and fornicators who were making use of his name to sanction their corruption. "We have among us," he said in part, "thieves, adulterers, liars, hypocrites. If God should speak from heaven, he would command you not to steal, not to commit adultery, not to covet, nor deceive, but be faithful over a few things. As far as we degenerate from God, we descend to the devil and lose knowledge, and without knowledge we cannot be saved. The church must be cleansed, and I proclaim against all iniquity, a man is saved no faster than he gets knowledge." Joseph could with certain honesty inveigh against adultery in the same week that he slept with another man's wife, or indeed several men's wives, because he had interposed a very special marriage ceremony. And that's the end of that chapter, but I am going to quickly cover the next chapter as there's not as much in this one. I know this video is longer, but I really wanted to cover the second chapter in this one as well. So this is chapter 22, the Bennett explosion. I talked a little bit about John C. Bennett in a previous video. He was one of Joseph's very trusted men until he wasn't. Here she writes, "In mid-July 1841, he had again discovered that Bennett was seducing innocent women, this time in the name of the prophet, and with the promise of marriage. Joseph said that when he confronted Bennett with the evidence, and also with letters showing him to be a wife deserter, Bennett in despair took poison, not enough to kill himself, though he was a physician, and able to measure the correct dose, but enough to convince everyone that his repentance was sincere." And that's also in the history of the church. Actually, Bennett may have been taking spiritual wives with Joseph's complete sanction, as were Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball early in 1842. But it is clear from the innuendos in Joseph's statement that Bennett looked upon the whole celestial marriage paraphernalia as mere show and dispensed with it whenever he pleased. So if you remember, Joseph's brother had warned him of Bennett and his history, but Joseph wouldn't listen at that point. But now that Bennett's starting to do things he doesn't agree with, all of a sudden he's bringing up, "Oh, Yes, you deserted your children and your family. In the spring of 1842, Joseph realized he was nurturing a volatile and dangerous rival. This all started with 19-year-old Nancy Rigdon, who was the daughter of Sidney. We've talked about Sidney. He was another one of the high-up men. Since Joseph's courtship of Nancy was described by her brother John and her brother-in-law George W. Robinson, as well as by Bennett, there is no reason for doubting the story, as some people would have you do. Joseph arranged for a private interview with Nancy at the home of Mrs. Orson Hyde, but Nancy had been forewarned by Bennett and met his exhortations with tears and abuse, finally threatening to scream until the whole town came running unless he let her go home. The next day, Joseph made the mistake of dictating a letter to her. We've talked about the mothers of Israel and how they would bring in younger women. This meeting with Nancy Rigdon was set up by Nancy Mirinda Hyde. Joseph proposed to Nancy and she said no, so then he set up a meeting with Nancy Mirinda Hyde to have Nancy, the older Nancy, explain it to the younger Nancy. So Nancy Hyde told her these things looked strange to her at first, but she would become more reconciled on mature reflection. Imagine being a young girl and having an older woman come to you and say, I know this looks bad, but when you're more mature, you'll understand it. And so at this point was when Joseph wrote this letter to her. This is part of it. Happiness is the object and design of our existence and will be the end thereof, if we pursue the path that leads to it. And this path is virtue, uprightness, and faithfulness, holiness, and keeping all the commandments of God. But we cannot keep all the commandments without first knowing them. Whatever God requires is right, no matter what it is, although we may not see the reason thereof till long after the events transpire. If we seek first the kingdom of God, all good things will be added. So with Solomon. First he asked wisdom, and God gave it to him, and with it every desire of his heart, even things which might be considered abominable to all who understand the order of heaven, and only in part, but which in reality were right because God sanctioned by special revelation. This letter was written about a year before the Revelation and Doctrine and Covenants, but it had a lot of the same ideas. It's a much longer letter than this. It would take forever to read the whole thing. That's just the first part. This is something that made me so angry when I first learned about it, because when I was about 16 years old, I was hiking up to Timpanogos Cave. There's a mountain here in Utah that has a cave in it called Timpanogos Cave, and you hike up this mile trail to get to it, and then you go through the cave and then come back down. And as a teenager, I was doing this hike, and on my way down, there was an older man at the bottom, and he gave me a necklace. It was just a very simple chain with a little coin-looking thing on it. And on one side, it said, men are that they might have joy, from the Book of Mormon. And on the opposite side, it said, happiness is the object and design of our existence. And I actually put that onto a different chain with my dad's dog tags that I had from Vietnam. And I wore that for a long time. Not every day, but I wore it over the course of years. I wore it quite often. And then I had it in just a little memory box for a long time. I might still have it somewhere, but I'm not sure. And I didn't know as a teenage girl that I was wearing a charm that had a quote that Joseph Smith used to try to get a teenage girl to marry him. That quote is cited by church leaders all the time without the context of where it came from. In the context of that letter, you will see how he twisted the scripture by saying that something that seems abominable to us, that God requires it even if we don't see how, and using Solomon in the story. He tried to normalize Solomon having the 700 wives and the 300 concubines and to make it more acceptable to her. But even the Book of Mormon says that Solomon had many wives and concubines, which thing was abominable before me, saith the Lord. So with this polygamy, he was constantly going against things that he had earlier put in the Book of Mormon. This letter was so manipulative, and toward the end of it, he switched to writing it as if it was in the voice of God. Nancy showed this letter to her father, who until this point had apparently been unaware of polygamy, and she told him of Joseph Smith's advances toward her. Wild with fury, Rigdon sent for him at once. George Robinson, who was present when he arrived, wrote to a friend that Joseph at first denied everything, but when Rigdon thrust the letter in his face, he broke down and admitted the truth, lamely excusing himself by saying he had merely been testing Nancy's virtue. However, the story got out, Nancy's brother John commented in later years, and it became the talk of the town that Joseph had made a proposition to Nancy Rigdon to become his wife and that she refused him. This brother also said that Joseph had said that, quote, he had made a proposal to Nancy Rigdon to become his wife and she, like a fool, had to go blab it. Of course, when Bennett was spreading this around as well, he was blamed for it. On May 11th, 1842, he drew up a bull of excommunication. But he knew that Bennett could be the most deadly enemy the church had ever faced. Seeking a way to stop his mouth, he called in several women whose names had been linked with that of the celebrated doctor and questioned them sharply. Now, apparently for the first time, he learned the full measure of Bennett's debauchery. Bennett had seduced innumerable women in Joseph's name quite without benefit of ceremony. Even worse, he had promised abortion to those who became pregnant. Zechariah N. Goddard, repeating the gossip of Sarah Pratt, reported that Dr. Bennett told her he could cause abortion with perfect safety to the mother at any stage of pregnancy, and that he had frequently destroyed and removed infants before their time to prevent exposure of the parties, and that he had the instruments for that purpose. So during this time, Bennett is getting blamed for talking about it and continuing to talk about it. But also at this time, they are trying to ruin Nancy's reputation. So Orson Hyde said, quote, becoming so notorious in this city, according to rumors, she was regarded generally little as if any better than a public prostitute. And Joseph Jackson said, when, as happens in the cases of Miss Martha Brotherton and Miss Nancy Rigdon, the prophet's overtures were rejected with disdain and exposure, he threatened that he would set 100 hellhounds on them to destroy their reputation. So they're trying to destroy the reputation of the girls that say no, and they're trying to shut everyone up. So back to Bennett. When he entered the prophet's office, he wrote, Joseph locked the door, put the key in his pocket, drew a pistol, and said without preamble, the peace of my family requires that you should sign an affidavit and make a statement before the next city council, exonerating me from all participation in whatever, whether directly or indirectly, in word or deed, in the spiritual wife doctrine, or private intercourse with females in general. And if you do not do it with apparent cheerfulness, I will make catfish bait of you, or deliver you to the Danites for execution tonight. For my dignity and purity must and shall be maintained before the public. Joseph went out, but was forced to concede Bennett the privilege of an amicable withdrawal and a public vote of thanks for his service as mayor of Nauvoo. On May 19th, Bennett appeared before the city council and began with a twisted smile. I know what I am about, and the heads of the church know what they are about, I expect. I have no difficulty with the heads of the church. I publicly avow that anyone who has said that I have stated that General Joseph Smith has given me authority to hold illicit intercourse with women is a liar in the face of God. Joseph had hoped that Bennett would slip out of Nauvoo into oblivion, but he had not reckoned with the man's tenacity. So for a time, Joseph hoped that Bennett would just kind of go away. He wouldn't talk about it anymore. And when everybody expected him to be excommunicated, he wasn't. And he even cried and begged for mercy, and Joseph stood up for him. But Bennett didn't go away, and he remained a sore on the church, so Joseph eventually decided to cut him off. On June 23, 1842, he publicly exposed him and issued the bull of excommunication, which had been held in reserve since May 11th. Bennett wasn't going to go quietly, and so he ended up writing a series of letters about all of the scandal in Nauvoo and exposing everything that Joseph did. He pretended that he had joined the church in order to expose Joseph Smith, which I don't believe is true. And he told all sorts of things, some of which may or may not be true. So some of the things we can't know if they were true or not. And so we have to look at the things that he said and match them up with other people's statements to kind of know what things were more accurate. During this chapter, she also talks about two more wives, Sarah Ann Whitney and Eliza R. Snow. So I'm going to quickly go over the two of them. Sarah Ann Whitney was 17 years old when she married Joseph Smith. She was the eldest daughter of Newell K. Whitney and Elizabeth Ann Whitney. She was born 1825 in Kirtland. She was 13 years old when her family left Kirtland, and shortly after the Kirtland Safety Society failure that I talked about on a previous video. Her father was a trader and storekeeper, and she grew up in great comfort with a nice house. But on May 4th, 1842, Newell got the endowment and became a member of the Holy Order. Joseph Smith introduced him at that point to the doctrine of plural marriage. They resisted at first. Her mother wrote this: he had been strictly charged by the angel, and spoke of Joseph Smith revealing these things to her husband, who then revealed them to her. She said that they pondered and they prayed on these things, and God revealed his power to them. She says, our hearts were comforted and our faith made so perfect that we were willing to give our eldest daughter, then only 17 years of age, to Joseph in the holy order of plural marriage. So Sarah married him in a private ceremony in July of 1842. Joseph Smith then had a revelation for her father. Verily, thus saith the Lord unto my servant Newell K. Whitney, that this thing that my servant Joseph Smith has made known unto you and your family, and which you have agreed upon, is right in mine eyes, and shall be rewarded upon your heads with honor and immortality and eternal life to all your house, both old and young. So her father performed the ceremony. And about this time, Joseph Smith sent her brother Horace on a mission. Joseph knew that he couldn't tell this brother because he would not approve. And they spoke of this brother as this wayward son, but he promised them that this son, no matter what, would also be saved and have his salvation if she married him. Shortly after her marriage to him, Joseph Smith was at Carlos Granger's house in hiding. In a letter written in his own hand, dated August 18th, 1842, he wrote, the only thing to be careful of is to find out when Emma comes. Then you cannot be safe. But when she is not here, there is the most perfect safety. Later on in the letter, I think Emma won't come tonight. Don't fail to come tonight. It was after this time that the letter saying polygamy wasn't happening was signed by the members that I've shown before, and Newell K. Whitney was one of the signers 2 months after this wedding. So now she's a 17-year-old, she's married to Joseph, and of course it has to be secret. She's young, and there are other men in the area that are starting to be interested in her. So Joseph Smith had her marry a man named Joseph C. Kingsbury in what is known as a pretend or a sham wedding. Joseph Kingsbury had a wife that he had been very much in love with, and she had died. And Joseph promised him that he would be sealed to this wife that had died for eternity if he granted Joseph Smith this favor and pretended to be married to Sarah. So he did know, obviously, that Joseph Smith was married to her and that his marriage to her was fake, and went along with it. We don't have a ton about her story, but if you stop and think about this young girl, 17 years old, married to Joseph Smith, and then having to be in a pretend marriage with another man so that she wouldn't be able to live the way a 17-year-old should have at that time and marry a boy that was probably closer to her age and somebody that might have actually loved her. After Joseph Smith's death, then her and Joseph Kingsbury were able to end their fake marriage, and he later on remarried someone else, and she was married to the apostle Heber C. Kimball and became one of his, at that time, 39 wives. But she was only married to Kimball for a time, and she was married to Joseph for eternity. She ended up having 7 children with Heber C. Kimball, but 2 of them died. And she died in 1873 at 48 years old from brain fever. And then the last one I'm going to talk about in this video is Eliza R. Snow. She was considered one of the greatest women in church history. She was born in 1804 in Massachusetts. She's spoken of as lively and talented from a very young age. She would sometimes write her school lessons out in rhyme. She became the secretary for her father's office as he was the justice of the peace, and she earned an income as a seamstress and a school teacher. Between the years of 1826 and 1832, she published more than 20 poems, so she was a very prolific writer. Her eyes were described as deep, penetrating, full of meaning and intelligence, with poetic fire. They were indeed the windows of a noble soul. She was articulate in speech, thoughtful, and deliberate. At 22, she wrote The Fall of Missolonghi, recounting the battle between Greece and Turkey, and she was then asked to write a requiem upon the deaths of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. So she was getting very well known locally for her writing. She published poetry in all of the local magazines and newspapers, and she won awards for this. In 1828, at 24 years old, she joined the Campbellites, which I talked about in a previous video. She would later obviously join Mormonism. She moved to Kirtland in December of 1835 and donated a large amount of money to the temple project. She was issued a very valuable lot situated near the temple with a fruit tree, an excellent spring of water, and a house that accommodated 2 families. But she was boarding at the house of Joseph Smith at this time, so her older sister lived there in one part of the house, and then they rented out the other part. In 1838, she relocated to Missouri and then to Illinois. In 1842, Emma selected her to be the secretary for the Relief Society. A few months later, in June of 1842, she married Joseph Smith. She wrote later, "One of the most important events of my life I have never had cause to regret." When she talked of him, she would say, "My beloved husband, the choice of my heart and the crown of my life." She was definitely one of the wives, besides Emma, that seemed to really actually love Joseph Smith. She ended up living with the Smiths again in Nauvoo and stayed for 6 months until February 11th, 1843, when she was kicked out by Emma. Charles Rich said this. He was an eyewitness, and there are many accounts of this same situation, but I'm going to read Charles Rich's account. "A door upstairs opened, and dainty little dark-haired Eliza R. Snow, she was heavy with child, came out. Joseph then walked up where he tenderly kissed Eliza and then came on down the stairs toward Brother Rich. Just as he reached the bottom step, there was a commotion on the stairway, and both Joseph and Brother Rich turned quickly to see Eliza come tumbling down the stairs. Emma had pushed her in a fit of rage and jealousy. She stood at the top of the stairs, glowering, her countenance a picture of hell. Joseph quickly picked up the little lady, and with her in his arms, turned and looked up at Emma, who then burst into tears and ran into her room. Joseph carried the hurt and bruised Eliza up the stairs and to her room. Her hip was injured, and she has always afterward favored her other leg. She lost the unborn baby. According to others, Emma turned Eliza Snow into the streets in her nightclothes while the family looked on crying. And she would never have more children, and a lot of people pointed to this, that she had been pregnant, lost a baby, and somehow not able to have more. Eliza was overcome with grief when Joseph Smith died. And she says that she prayed to die too until he came to her in a vision and told her to be of good cheer. On October 3rd, 1844, she was sealed to Brigham Young. for Time. She would go on to publish more poetry books, to be the General Relief Society president, and to write many of the hymns that the LDS Church still sings. She died in 1887 at 84 years old. So I'm going to stop this video here, and the next one will start right here where we have left off. We're going to get some of the hardest stories in the next video.